Well, let's keep it here in the studio now for more perspective. I'm being joined by Joseph Wambia, CEO of the Wambia Capital Group. Mr. Wambia, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me, Vincent.
Now, first, we saw the president there. One of the initiatives that he announced is the Power Africa initiative. This is a $7 billion initiative. How significant is that?
I think it's extremely significant because energy, as in power, is probably one of the single most significant constraints to economic development and the cost of doing business in Africa. More than half or 80% of Africa in the rural areas are in darkness. And energy, electricity is extremely expensive, and most Africans have to have generators and other sources of energy which are inefficient. So this is big.
Yes, throughout this trip, we have not stopped talking about China, the comparisons in the investments in Africa. For example, when you talk about the $7 billion initiative, just a few months ago, the president of China reiterated that the country has set aside up to $20 billion to help African countries develop, among other things, electricity to connect the continent right from the south to the north. How do you compare that with the US $7 billion?
Well, I think the more the merrier. Africa needs $300 to $500 billion of investment to power the continent. So all these figures are significant, but they're a drop in the bucket, and there's room for everyone, as President Obama said. There's a big qualitative difference, however, between China's announced and promised volumes, which are usually not realized, and which are entirely implemented, sourced, and benefit Chinese companies, and usually they're Chinese government companies, so they're really not private companies, and U.S. investment, which transfers technology and is private sector blending with public-private partnerships. I'll go for U.S. investment any day over Chinese investment
because of the
focusing on quality.
And,
yes.
and you know, still people look at the volume, but still when you look at the U.S., what is the volume of trade, and at the end of the day, does it matter, the volume?
Well, quality matters more than the volume. I think Africa has to be very careful not to be seduced by China's approach, which basically says they ignore human rights, ignore governance, and ignore everything, and just focus, basically turn a blind eye. This is what happened with slave trade. This is what happened with commodity trade, where African leaders sold their countries. So I think we have to be very careful and make sure that a genuine friend of Africa will invest and also hold African governments accountable for human rights and governance. Because if you look at Nigeria and all the commodities, the countries where Chinese and unfortunately in some cases US investment is prominent, they all have bad governance. So if you really want, like President Obama has emphasized, democracy and transparency is first and foremost. In terms of the volumes, they are remarkably similar. China's exports to Africa shot up from 37 billion in 2007 to 73 billion in 2011. That's double.
Yeah.
But U.S. exports, but Africa's exports to both China and U.S. have been significantly the same volume, around 93 billion each. So Africa exports more to China than
the U.S.
Both to China and U.S. more or less equal.
Yeah, very quickly, something that we really need to get in here. In the long run, Africa needs to figure out how to benefit from these powerful economies. Yes. How does it do that?
Surprisingly, Vincent, that's a very good question. A lot of people talk about focusing on getting U.S. investment or Chinese investment in Africa. These investments are meant to benefit Chinese and U.S. companies. The way for Africa to grow and to generate employment and tax revenue and real growth is for African companies to begin investing in China, in the United States, and thereby directly tap these vast markets. And those investments will act as a pull factor for massive employment and tax revenue generation back in Africa, not the other way around.
Thank you, and that is subject to another big discussion. Thank you very much,
Thanks for having
Joseph
me.
Wambia of the Wambia Capital.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us.